This is a conquest guide. This is not an in-depth, super detailed conquest guide. This is a guide that will get you into conquest if you A, haven't played conquest before and want to try it out with Season 5, B, come for another game, C, have taken a long break, or D, just need a refresher. I will talk about the very simple basics of conquest in a very understandable, simple way. There will be an in-depth version to this guide later down the road, once the meta is settled a little bit more, but if you need a way to get into SMITE Conquest somehow and you're not sure what to do, this is where you can start. And this also goes for any of your friends. If you have any of your friends trying out the game or getting back into the game, this should get them up to the point of knowledge where they can jump into Conquest without hesitation, while not making the video too long. Let's go. We begin with the most important thing, wards. Buy wards whenever you can. Buy a Chalice of the Oracle when you can. Place the wards around corners, around areas where you think enemies will be coming from. Exact ward spots aren't all that important as long as you ward. Strategical warding is nice, but having a ward placed in the first place is the crucial part. If you always bring some wards whenever you back and use them as often as possible, then you'll be on the right track. Warding is also one of the key differences from other game modes. The other key difference are objectives. Objectives are what wins you games in Conquest most of the time. There's the exception where you can split push your way through, but normally you want to go for objectives that will allow you to defeat the enemy team easier and take down their base. There are 4 major objectives on the Conquest map, which I will rank here by game impact. The first one are Oracle Furies. Oracle Furies are the bonus to the Gold Fury, so to speak. They are next to the Gold Fury, and killing both of them will grant you vision of the Gold Fury for a certain amount of time. This is basically like a free ward on the Gold Fury that the enemy team can't clear. Next up, we have the Gold Fury as well as the Pyromancer. Both objectives are very different, but have a similar impact. The Gold Fury will give your team a lot of extra gold, but will require multiple people off your team for the most part of the game to be cleared in the first place. Usually you want to have at least 3 people to clear effectively, unless we're talking about late game. The Pyromancer, on the other hand, is not that heavy on the gold side, but gives you a movement speed boost when you're leaving the base. This movement speed boost roughly lasts until you are around your towers, so you should be able to make decent use of it. After clearing this, you can get back to Fire Giant quicker, or you can get back to another objective or another lane that you want to push out. If the enemy team is going for a Gold Fury and you know that you can't really fight them there, you can consider going for the Pyromancer at the same time or the other way around in order to still get something going for your team. The most impactful objective is the Fire Giant. The Fire Giant will give your entire team a power increase, a health regeneration, and a damage increase against structures, as well as some extra mana regeneration, which will make sieging towers and phoenixes a lot easier. As taking down those is key to winning the game, as you want to reach the Titan somehow, this can really be utilized very well in order to close out a game, especially when you're otherwise stuck. As such, one of the most crucial wards should always be a sentry ward at the Fire Giant and Pyromancer past 10 minutes into the game. And talking about those 10 minutes, the spawn time for the Oracles is at 35 seconds into the game, the spawn time for the Gold Fury is 5 minutes into the game, and both the Pyromancer and Fire Giant spawn at 10 minutes. Quick reminder, don't forget to buy wards. Before we get a little bit more into the details, let's quickly talk about the map layout. There are 3 lanes, the long lane, which is typically referred to as the duo lane, the middle lane, and the short lane, typically referred to as the solo lane. As the name indicates, long lane, duo lane will often have 2 people, whereas the other lanes are for 1 person, and in addition to that, you have a jungler. Oracles and Gold Fury are towards the duo or long lane side of the map, whereas the Fire Giant and Pyromancer are towards the solo lane or short lane side of the map. But that's not all we find in the jungle parts of the map. We also have 4 buff camps. Towards the duo side, we have the purple buff and the red buff. Towards the solo side, we have the speed buff located a bit further to the back, which is also referred to as the yellow buff or sometimes orange buff, and the blue buff. The blue buff gives you mana regeneration and cooldown reduction, meaning you can use your abilities more often. In other words, 25 mana per 5 seconds and 10% cooldown reduction. This buff is typically picked up by the solo laner, as that person will be on their own and will need to sustain, meaning they will need to stay in lane for a long time and be able to use their abilities as long and as often as possible. The yellow or speed buff, as the name indicates, gives you a movement speed increase, 15%. This one is picked up by the jungler to allow the jungler to rotate around the jungle faster and go from camp to camp quicker, picking them up faster in the progress obviously. Most junglers are very defensive about their speed buffs, as they kinda are almost mandatory in order to rotate the map relatively quickly. Many of the other buffs are often interchangeable between characters. With speed buff, that's not so much the case. On the dual lane side of the map, we can look at red buff first. Red buff is kind of more towards the middle lane, and it gives the character that picks it up a damage increase, both in terms of flat damage as well as percentage damage. In numbers, it gives a 20% damage increase and 10 magical or 5 physical power. This damage increase can be utilized by both hunters as well as mages, which is why you sometimes see the mid laner picking this up, or sometimes see the AD carry, the hunter, the dual laner pick this buff up. And sometimes you kind of see them fighting over it. The purple buff, more towards the dual lane side of the map, provides the person who picks it up with both flat protection reduction as well as percentage protection reduction. 10 flat protection reduction, 5% protection reduction. As this is an aura, it's often picked up by the support. The aura means that it's only in a radius around the character, which means you have to get relatively close for the effect, so for ranged characters it's often not as useful. You will see this being picked up by the hunter as well though, especially nowadays that the mage picks up red more often again, as that way they still get a damage increase and they can kinda stay in lane on their own, and in the direct trades with the other hunter they're typically in range for it to work. All buffs reappear or spawn every 2 minutes and last 2 minutes after picking them up. So if you want an exact indication of when a buff camp will respawn, you just look at your buff timer that you have on you, and if you time it perfectly you can pick it up again right away. By the way, you don't have to kill the jungle buff monster yourself, your jungler can do that for you, as the buff will drop on the ground and has to be picked up. Also, did I mention that you should ward? So where on the map should you go? There are always multiple options on how to start exactly, but at the moment with how the camps spawn and when the waves clash, it's actually quite simple. The speed buff will be attackable at roughly 0.24, whereas the waves clash around 30 seconds and the other buff camps spawn around 0.35. What does that mean? The dual lane will most likely start in dual lane most of the time, meaning your hunter and your support both start in the long lane. The solo laner will start in solo on the short lane on his own as well. Both will clear their wave and then try to go for other camps between the waves when they can and when they're able to. Mid lane and jungle is only slightly more complex. Typically, both the jungler and the mid laner start at the speed camp, the yellow buff. They will clear that together and then the mid laner will go to lane so he can get level 2 after the first wave right away, whereas the jungler will keep roaming through the jungle. It will quite often still happen that the mid laner will start in mid lane right away because they don't know about this, so that's fine too, and that might be the meta that turns out to be more of the standard at the end anyways. But from our current understanding, it should be better for the mid laner to help the jungler on the first speed buff. The jungler then goes on to the back harpies, which are right next to the speed buff basically, then moves to the blue buff and then to mid lane, or moves from the back harpies to mid lane to the mid camps and then onto the lane and helps with the blue buff later on. In terms of how you keep on farming, jungle is probably a little more complex after this point, so I can't go too in depth here, but what I will say is that typically you want to clear the solo side of the map, at least for the most part, and then move over to duo and clear basically all the buffs there, maybe the back hubs too. You kind of want to avoid the oracles on your own because they do too much damage and they're too tanky, but everything else you can clear on your own or with the help of your allies that rotate over from lanes. And you can basically do that on repeat in order to get sufficient XP and keep the jungle cleared for the most part of the game. In between, obviously always look for openings to kill someone, to gank someone with your teammates, meaning you come into the lane from the side and attack the enemy when they don't expect it. And the jungler is the reason you buy wards, or at least one of the reasons, so buy wards. Before we move on from the jungler here, here's a little map where you can see the current XP values. I've tweeted it out on my Twitter and also added some extra explanations on certain rotations you can do as a jungler. If you want to go in depth with that, then feel free to check that out, link will be down below. Now we get to the point of communication. Use the chat when you need to, but usually that's the most inefficient way to do it. There are two things that you should learn at least over time. One is pinging, which is usually done by pressing Alt or whatever your free mouse button is, and then clicking on the minimap. There are two different kinds of pings you can use. One is a little more subtle, the other one is more aggressive. That should be used to ping out enemies coming to lanes or objectives you want to go for, stuff like that. And also, once you get used to it, VGS, the voice guided system. By using the VGS, pressing V and then other commands afterwards, you'll be able to communicate with your allies, letting them know what you're about to do, what's happening in a very short keystrokes. This is very important in Conquest in order to communicate as fast as possible and not get stuck typing somewhere. And last but not least, let's talk a little bit about item builds. Now, item builds depend on the character you're playing as well as the role you're playing and all those kind of things. I will give you some very basic builds that I think will especially work for newer players learning the game, some safe options that work in the current meta. These builds will eventually be outdated, they will not work the same for every character, they will not be good on certain characters of that role, but they will give you a general idea if you're completely new to the game. I would not recommend going with these builds for any longer than necessary, but rather learning what specific builds a specific character needs through different guides, through different info sources, or just asking others in-game. We will tie that information with the character you're typically playing in a role. The first role we're talking about is Support, one of the characters in duo lane. The Support is typically a Guardian or at least a character that can soak up a lot of damage. We've also seen some other niche cases in Season 5, but that's nothing you should concern yourself with as a beginner. A standard Support build will look something like this: Guardian's Blessing, Traveler's Shoes, Gauntlet of Thebes, Sovereignty, Hardwood Amulet, Spirit Robe, and Hide of the Nemean Lion. An item that you should avoid these days that was more common before is Hide of the Urchin. Gauntlet of Thebes is just much easier to stack and allows for more team utility at the same time, so that should be the preferred choice. As you notice, these are 7 items, so you'll be ditching the starter item, the Guardian's Blessing, at the end of the game. And with that, let's move on to Hunters. With Hunters, you start with Hunter's Blessing, Devourer's Gauntlet, Ninja Tabi, Deathbringer, Poison Star, Executioner, and then Wind Demon, at which point you trade out Hunter's Blessing. The Hunter accompanies the support in duo lane and will stay in duo lane even after the support leaves, trying to farm up as much as possible for later stages of the game. Mages are typically found in mid lane. The builds are currently all over the place, so I tried to find a build that does a lot of damage and gives you a lot of survivability, especially a lot of damage in hitting a single ability, so even if you don't hit that much yet, you will still hit the enemy hard. That build is Mage's Blessing, Warlock's Staff, which you will have to stack first, Shoes of the Magi, Obsidian Shard, Ethereal Staff, Soul Reaver, and Book of the Dead. Especially to more experienced players, this build may look a little weird, but trust me, it will get the job done for that purpose. Alternatively, you can also look into some cooldown reduction options to use your abilities more often. The solo laner is often the warrior, though we also see some guardians in that role and more assassins, and their role is often to be a secondary frontliner. As such, you want Warrior's Blessing into Warrior Tabi, Stone of Gaia, Mystical Mail, Spirit Robe, Bulwark of Hope, and Hide of the Nemean Lion. Note that especially if you're playing a more ability-focused warrior, like for example Tyr, you want to throw some more protection items with cooldown reduction in there to get more abilities off. And last but not least, we have the jungler, typically an assassin. This build would be for many ability-based assassins, but there are a lot of outliers here too. Assassin's Blessing, Talaria Boots, Jotun's Wrath, Hydra's Lament, Brawler's Beatstick, Titan's Bane, and Mantle of Discord. If your character can throw in some more basic attacks, you can also use Deathbringer as a last item, but I'm not going to recommend it in this guide in case it gets nerfed too soon. Now there's a ton more things I would like to say in this video, like for example, buy more wars, but we're running out of time. As such, I will thank you guys for watching. I will hopefully see you for the in-depth guide soon, or maybe all the other info videos about Smite that I have on my channel. Feel free to leave a like, sub, all that kind of stuff if you enjoyed this, it really helps me out. See you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth out. So I actually figured out my demonetization issue and it was my outro. As such, feel free to click any of the links around here right now. There will be new outro music as soon as I find something nice. Until then, as you guys requested, I will do the outro music myself. You're welcome.